This video can't really be started with anything but a warning. We've covered the history from Black Lagoon before, and every single story has been atrocious in its own way. But the story of the twins and the history they're based on is something almost impossible to describe the true horror of. The shock and disgust of what we'll be covering goes far beyond a piece of animation and well into some of the darkest aspects of humanity. If you simply want to watch a video on anime, I wouldn't recommend watching this one. You'll instead be seeing images of genuine human anguish and physical horror. But I think it's a story we need to be reminded of, the kind of atrocity that we can't simply look away from if we ever want humanity to be better than it was or is. I'm also only speaking on a small sliver of the entire story, the complexities of which are well better left to people more versed on it than I. But there's no point to putting anything more to this intro than that warning in those mentioned sources, so we'll cover the history first and then look at how the twins are influenced by that real-world history. In 1965, Romania was forever changed by the emergence of a new leader, Nicolae Ceaușescu, an iron-fisted authoritarian whose regime was ripe with corruption and the activities of secret police. He had a vision of an industrialized Romania, one which would require a large and active pool of workers for the future. To accomplish this, he began to take drastic measures to increase the population. In 1966, he banned contraceptives and effectively banned abortions. By 1967, he made divorce ostensibly impossible, and 10 years later, he imposed tax penalties on childless families, adding legal penalties a few years later to those who refused to have children. Women were subjected to examinations every 3 months at work to deduce if they were pregnant, so that they could later be punished if they received an illegal abortion, which had become much more common and much more dangerous, leading to a severe increase in related deaths. Ceaușescu remarked, "The fetus is the property of the entire society, and anyone who avoids having children is a deserter who abandons the laws of national continuity." Families with excessive numbers of children were heralded as heroic, and meanwhile in the early 80s, Ceaușescu's policies were bankrupting the entire country. He sold the fruit supply abroad and slashed budgets to pay off the national debt, leading to Romania becoming one of Europe's poorest countries. But his family policies remained the same, if not worsening with time. Forced to have large families they couldn't provide for, the state offered a supposed solution: orphanages. Signs outside the facilities had statements like, "The state can take better care of your child than you can." While these orphanages had existed since the Second World War, they now became a necessity for families who were either forced to have children they never wanted or could no longer provide for the ones they did. While the exact number of children in this system can never be known, estimates generally agree on a lower threshold, at minimum 100,000 abandoned children. They became known as Ceaușescu's children. As they said, after all, he was the one who wanted them, let him take care of them. In an isolated and closed-off society like Romania, one which isolated itself even from the other Warsaw Pact countries, the true conditions of these facilities remained unknown to the outside world, and even to their own citizens. But care is an optimistic word for what these children received. With the population boom and economic downturn, they became excessively overcrowded, and at the same time, underfunded and understaffed. In the 1970s, Ceaușescu saw nursing and healthcare as low priorities for Romania's future, so institutions related to medical professions were largely shuttered. This led to the orphanages being staffed not by trained professionals, but by local and underpaid citizens. But even if they were trained, the isolationist government didn't allow them access to medical advancements from around the world, and they were equipped with antiquated technology, knowledge, and practices. This led to severe hepatitis B and HIV/AIDS outbreaks among the children due to reused and unsterilized needles. A preventable man-made disaster within another preventable man-made disaster. Not every orphanage was plagued by awful conditions, but this doesn't make the story any easier to hear. At the age of 3, children were sorted out of the general facilities and into more specific ones. Those who were seen as fit to become future workers were sent to better homes where they would receive the necessities of life, enough to survive at least. But others, those labeled unsalvageable, were sent to homes with the idea that these lives were already over, and so they essentially were. The homes for the unsalvageable saw the lowest priority and the worst treatment. The understaffing and overcrowding led to a situation where it was impossible to care for every child. They were tied down to beds or cribs with metal bars, and pacified with tranquilizers if they were too much trouble. They remained there for days on end, wasting away in their own filth, unchanged and hungry, hardly kept alive by a starvation diet. Kept on bottles long past appropriate, some never learned to feed themselves, even into adolescence. With no physical activity and restrained all day, their muscles deteriorated. Some would have their bottles slip away, and then they themselves wasted away, unable to even simply bring it back up to their mouth, and with no one coming by to check on them to notice. This physical neglect led to them being solidified as unsalvageable. They were left with lifelong disabilities, often stemming from conditions which were easily manageable or curable, but became unable to treat in these conditions and after so long of worsening. The children whose bodies were left forever mangled by their treatment were taken out of the system at the age of 18, to be placed in elderly homes. While others were lucky enough to avoid this fate, they didn't find one much better. At 18, everyone was dropped from the system, and if not sent to a home, it was into the world with no possessions, no money, no home, nothing at all. Most would be resigned to a life on the streets, unable to adapt to a society which they had never seen even once in their formative years. And this brings us to the other side of their issues. While the physical treatment was horrendous and destroyed their bodies, their minds fared just as awfully. Punishment was encouraged. As many recounted, they learned to internalize every emotion they felt. If they acted out, they would simply be tied down or sedated. If they reported issues with a fellow child, that child would be beaten and would return to beat the one who reported them. So they learned to never speak up, whatever the matter was. With no stimulation whatsoever in their formative years, their minds wasted away, fully underdeveloped. Their bodies reacted with jarring and erratic motion, many reported as constantly bashing their heads against whatever was around or with their own limbs, leading to them being restrained and understimulated even more. In one well-documented story of a child who was adopted, he recounted how easy it was to tell adults who were once resigned to these facilities. They rocked back and forth constantly, fully characteristic of the behavior in these orphanages. Without a family, with no attention and no care, many of the children formed attachment issues. In the 90s, after Ceaușescu's fall in the opening of Romania, prospective adopters recounted how the children would cling to them after only a few moments, unwilling to let one of the single people to ever show them any kind of affection or care for their entire lives slip away. Sometimes they would exhibit this behavior with other orphans, forming extreme codependencies. One chilling quote sums this all up best. "Imagine how that must feel, to be miserable and not even know that another human being could help." Upon the opening of the country and studies being conducted, researchers found that around 40% of the teenagers they studied from these facilities were diagnosed with major psychiatric conditions. They had stunted motor and language skills. MRIs revealed the brain volume of those institutionalized was below those who never were, along with lower brain activity detected by EEGs. Science now had the opportunity to explore something utterly inhumane, the mental effects of those whose lives had never begun. While Ceaușescu's fall in late 1989 led to a frenzy of international attention, assistance, and adoptions, it didn't come close to solving the issues. As the state removed itself from the Iron Curtain, the already minimal workers were no longer required to keep their positions. Many left to find much better paying and less taxing work. Those who remained, even those who were more trained, weren't capable of immediately handling the flood of donated equipment which they were unfamiliar with. Donated washers and dryers, for example, were too modern for the antiquated plumbing and electrical systems. Many donated secondhand items couldn't be effectively fixed due to a lack of tools, and then the lack of workers led to some donations, like proper winter clothes, going unopened and never used. The new government was inexperienced and unable to effectively distribute aid, even with such a massive influx. The children could now receive care from international workers who were better trained, but the situation was so unprecedented, even many of those professionals were at a loss for what proper care should be. And while many prospective adopters from around the world were taking children into homes where they could receive the start they needed, the key word is start. Most families returned with children under the age of 3, leaving those who were older and with even more issues in the exact same situations which had characterized their lives so far. Adoption also became a business of sorts. Brokers and agencies would charge anywhere from $2,500 to $15,000, making it a matter of money for those with ill intentions. Adding to this issue, the wait times and general process, such as needing the consent of the child's biological parents, many of whom were unknown, led to alternative solutions. For many shady brokers, a black market of adoptions arose. They promised short wait times and a cheaper price, but had to avoid the institutions unless they had an inside contact who would overlook their practice. So, in a combination with the economic downturns and Ceaușescu's policies affecting the lower classes the harshest, these brokers would perform cold calls. They would enter local villages and seek out parents willing to sell their children for adoption, often talking them down to a price of just $1,000. Naturally, this was all done after promising the adoptive families children from the orphanages, but taking them on a wild goose chase of a process, showing families the same children and claiming they'd been surprise adopted already, and then claiming adoptions would soon be outlawed so they had to act fast until the families finally gave in. This also relied heavily on forged documents, often including the children's medical exams, with families unaware they were taking home children with hepatitis B or even HIV/AIDS. For how lengthy, taxing, and horrifying that section was, it's only a small slice of the situation, one which has much more detail and nuance, sombering personal recountings, and a story which continued long after Ceaușescu's reign, and whose effects are still being felt to this day. It was also something I wasn't even aware existed until I started researching for this video. A completely incomprehensible dark corner of human history which, as far as I've seen, has been a lesson lost to many of us. Another account of how the actions of a few evil men can change the entire course of human history, and the saddest part, and no more so than here, end lives before they even have a chance to begin. It's this aspect that makes it impossible to simply transition to talking about an anime without acknowledgement, but also the very thing which makes it so connected. While Black Lagoon only gives us a brief description of the history and adds its own individual detail to the story, it does capture that feeling. That of children whose lives never even got the chance to begin. It's here we find the story of the Romanian Twins. With a few lines from the anime, we can assemble a rough timeline of their history. Sometime in the early 80s, they were born into a depressed village in the Carpathian Mountains. Likely within the first year of their life, and maybe even sooner than that, they were left at one of these orphanages where they spent most of their lives. We can assume, based on their physical health, that they weren't in a home for the so-called unsalvageable, but based on their treatment, one which was just as much of a hell. From the specifics of Balalaika's search for
Eastern European kiddie porn featuring Romanian twins,
Rock's mention of how
the secret police found numerous uses for these orphans,
and how the twins recount their time with the mafia, we can assume their general and sexual abuse started here. Balalaika also mentions how,
after Ceaușescu was overthrown, many children were sold to the black market by institutions that could no longer afford them.
while they somehow could have been bought and sold internationally before 1990, it's much less likely due to Romania's staunch isolationism. They also may have been bought internally before 1989 and then sold again, but we can only assume sometime in the early 1990s they were bought by the mafia and taken to Sicily, where they remained, mentioning the only places in their lives having been
back when we were in Sicily and we lived at the orphanage.
And our story begins once they were brought to Roberta to assassinate Balalaika for the Italian mafia there. One of their aspects that tracks directly from the orphanages is their extreme level of codependency on each other. They experienced a world with a complete lack of affection, care, or even simple attention. The only time they existed as far as others were concerned was to be raped or beaten. No human in their entire lives had shown them kindness. All they had was each other, and so they deepened that relationship to an extreme degree. They need each other for the things we all take for granted, for warmth, affection, or even simple conversation. These attachment issues are made even worse when you consider how bleak their specific situation was. All around them was death. They were close to it a likely uncountable number of times, and the only way they could avoid being killed themselves was to kill others. Acutely aware of death, they found a solution to ensure they would never be separated. They became each other. Even if death took one of them suddenly, it wouldn't matter because they were still together. We can see this directly when Rock brings up one of their deaths, and they reveal their dual personas to him. The development of these kinds of personas makes sense within their context as well. The way they avoided death was by being as entertaining as possible for their captors, a 6-stage act required by these demons. And when doing this, they were forced to take on roles like Hansel or Gretel. That became the way they presented themselves when avoiding death, to lean into what these scum wanted from them. In a world so full of constant death, it stands to reason they would become almost more comfortable when they were fulfilling these roles, because that was one time where they knew they wouldn't be killed as long as they made their captors happy. If they face death more when they're not in that state, then why ever leave it? All it does is open you up to a greater chance of being killed. To learn behavior, act it up, be like the people who survive, sadistic killers, because those are the only ones they'd ever seen to survive and be happy. As far as they've ever seen, that must just be what life is. This begins to explain how they, as they say, come to enjoy what they do. When Eda confronts one of the twins about why they're still trying to kill Balalaika, they laugh and say,
Because we want to. We don't need any other reason.
And speaking to Rock, they also say,
The smell of blood, the sound of screaming, and the warmth of bowels. We learned to love it all.
To understand this requires remembering life in the orphanages even before their treatment. They lived in a world where enjoyment, pleasure, or happiness simply didn't exist. All around them was pain and squalor, nothing more. No one paid attention to them except to sparingly keep them alive. That is, until they were bought or began to be forced into these films. Now they witnessed people who disgustingly looked happy, who smiled and delighted as children were raped and forced to slaughter each other. This is the first example of joy they had likely ever witnessed. So to their minds, these acts became joy itself. As they say, they learned to love what they did. Not helping this arrangement is the complete lack of value to life around them. It was never shown to them as something worthwhile. It either wasn't cared for or was actively ended without a second thought. They were bought and sold, even rejoicing when Eda tells them how much they're worth, saying,
Wow, that's pretty good.
the only value life has ever had for them is a dollar value, how much they made their owners on either films or being bought and sold. So they don't see murder as something that's wrong because people simply don't have any worth. But this isn't the only way their minds justify these actions. They explain the world as such.
It's not our fault, though. It's either kill or be killed, remember? That's what this world is all about.
In response to using a child to fake their car accident, and it's met with a response of,
You're right for telling me you. It wasn't our fault.
from the other. To them, it makes sense. This world isn't just harsh, it's literally a factory of death. To survive, they had to kill. The people who lorded over them constantly killed those who didn't themselves. Death made the world work. All things happened because death happened. So it's not wrong or their fault when they try to kill, it's simply the world acting as it does. This then extends into their spiritual beliefs, where they comment about eternal life because of everyone they've killed. This relates back to their codependency as well. They're utterly terrified of losing one another, while at the same time trying to internally justify what they were forced to do and rationalizing this world as kill or be killed. These combine to form this belief, which at its core is a rejection of death. They never mentally developed to handle such complex things as death. In their formative years, their brains were entirely stagnated or literally beaten. Even if they were as old as the rest of the cast, this would be their belief because they simply can't mentally handle the alternative. It's also logical in a messed up way, with how much we've mentioned only those who murder staying alive. You can extend this concept in a small world such as theirs. Those who kill actually have time added on to their existence. There's no way to disprove it to them because anyone who dies simply must not have killed enough. But they know firsthand that they have. This belief checks all the boxes for what they needed and what their brains could handle. One of their most shocking traits is how overtly sexual both of the twins are for their age. Naturally, this is another learned behavior from the films they were forced to be in, but the public nature of it can go back further than that. In the overcrowded institutions, there was no privacy, no money for clothing, and no method or time to clean what clothes they had. Without any of that, they would have lacked even the most basic measure of privacy, so this is something they simply wouldn't even think about, made worse by what they were forced to do while others watched, or even participated. In the way they use this to show appreciation or affection is similar to violence. It's the only thing anyone had ever shown themselves to desire from the twins, and it was encouraged unless they wanted to die on the spot. It became very casual for them, another fact of life. It's like a transactional way to please someone else. Only murder and sex have been shown to make people happy, so if they don't want murder, they must want sex. When Rock shows them kindness, something they do appreciate, having only ever known it vaguely from each other, they provide him the one thing everyone they've ever known has used them for. In the end, though, I think there is one thing they sought out on their own, a trait they formed of their own desire. I think this is a want for freedom. Their lives were held in captivity, with their earliest memories certainly being the metal bars of a cold crib. Even once they left the orphanage, they described their time in Sicily the same way, behind walls being beaten and neglected. They may have learned that murder was a necessity of the world, but they never internalized taking orders to do so as the same thing. Obviously, they acted out against their owners once given the slightest chance upon arrival in Roanapur, and from that moment the fate of their holders was sealed. They rebelled, went against their orders with this glimpse at freedom. They acted out and may have been yelled at, but were too terrifying to be attacked. This was their chance. Sadly, with this glimpse at freedom, their learned behavior was a bit stronger, and they still felt a desire for the happiness they saw others take in slaughter, and chased down their former target, leading to both of their deaths. In those final moments, we see them as they are without these personas, the masks of Hansel and Gretel or my brother and my sister, for the first time. The sad, pained cries of a child taking their last breaths, for the first time in years, able to do so without a fear of more pain. They were already dying, and despite their beliefs, likely knew the finality of it. There was no incentive to not make their pain aware for the first time in years. And the other, living those final few seconds under the perfect sky they'd always wanted to see, having no reason to hold that wish in any longer. They had freedom in those final moments from the struggle of life. The freedom to finally cry, or the freedom to look up at the sky and wonder, like any child should be able to do. The one moment of freedom found in two tragic lives which were over long before they had even begun.